So, we've gone through Nicaea and Constantinople, which in many ways were intricately connected. They dealt with the same concern from different perspectives. You know, Nicaea dealt with the nature of Christ, and Constantinople dealt with the nature of the triunity of the Godhead. Well, bringing in, of course, the necessity of recognizing the Holy Spirit as the third person of the Trinity. So we see that Christ and the Trinity were addressed prior to that. So there was a connected theme between Nicaea and Chalcedon. We saw Constantinople, and we saw that even though Nicaea addressed the major concern, it wasn't resolved. It was, 60 plus years of battles. So while they dealt with the same theme, there was this connection. But the interesting element about both of those councils was that orthodoxy, for the most part, had the prominent position. I mean, there were dissenters, there were the issues that had to be addressed. But orthodoxy was in view, for the most part, the majority view in both of those councils. We saw that with Nicaea, 18 bishops to 2. Ephesus is different. The tenor of the Council of Ephesus is much more challenging. And as the theological landscape starts to evolve, Nestorius, who was the Patriarch of Constantinople, I want you to pause for a minute. There were 5 primary sees. There were 5 primary patriarchal representations in the early church. And depending upon how you identify the chronology, Constantinople was either the second or the third one. So, we have Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch, which comes into play today, Constantinople, and Alexandria. So these are the 5 major bishoprics. These are the 5 major sees. And until we get to Ephesus, what we see, for the most part, is we see this collegiality among the 5 major sees. There's a slight change in Ephesus that we will see in just a minute. So Nestorius, as the Patriarch of Constantinople, introduced a further layer of complexity to the Christological debates in the early 5th century. So we talk about the deity of Christ, then we talk about the Trinity, and you think, okay, we're all done, all these arguments are over, and then somebody from the bleachers goes, oh, wait, no, I've got something else that I need to address. Now, we're not going to talk about him today. We will get to the main issues of the council next week. And then we will get to the real fun one the following week, and that's the filioque issue. And you are going to be surprised when I start reading to you some of the historical assessments of the filioque. Let's just say 1,800 years removed from the actual event has an entirely different sense and perspective than what was going on at the time. So, Nestorius pops up and decides that it's time to create more Christological concerns. From the West, and pay close attention as we go through these things because this is going to raise a lot of questions moving forward. From the West, Pope Celestine, C-E-L, E-S, Tine, Pope Celestine, as a patriarch of one of the principal sees, S-E-E', of the day, Rome, was very much aware of the situation in the East. And he kept a watchful eye, according to the responsibilities of his office as a defender of and guarantor of the orthodoxy of the faith and over the affairs of the church. And he had charged the Pope, charged Cyril of Alexandria, another see. He charged Blessed Cyril to provide to him a certain specific report of the doctrine of Nestorius, which was already in bad repute. And Cyril, in his communication with Nestorius, declares this directly in his letter to Nestorius. Now note this. We haven't gotten to Ephesus yet. We have two patriarchs, and yet one of them is given orders. Keep note of that. So, St. Cyril writes to Pope Celestine, gives a complete account. He sets forth the doctrines of Nestorius side by side with his own doctrines. And then he sends this communique to the pontiff and two letters to both parties, from himself to Nestorius and to the Pope. Nestorius, not to be outdone, does the same. He writes two letters and sends one to Cyril and sends one to the Pope. And he attempted to actually draw the Pope to his side of the dispute. That's, well, there's a phrase for that, but I'll just say that's gutsy. He has some moxie. Thus, the Holy Pontiff, having been fully informed by letters from both sides, is subsequently asked by Cyril, quote, "We have not confidently abstained from communion with him," Nestorius. "Before informing you of this, we're still having fellowship with him. Condescend, therefore," this is a patriarch petitioning the authority of another patriarch. "Condescend, therefore, to unfold your judgment, that we may clearly know whether we ought to communicate with him who cherishes such erroneous doctrine." So, Holy Father, Pontiff, good Pope, what do we do? And then he added, if that wasn't enough, that the Pope's judgment should be written to the other bishops, that all with one mind may hold firm in one sentence. S-E-N-T-E-N-C. We all want to be on the same theological page. Here we see Rome manifestly consulted by so great a man as Cyril of Alexandria, the presiding head over another patriarchal see, awaiting the judgment of Rome. And therefore Cyril could do nothing but that Celestine, being properly consulted, should perform his apostolic office. Now, I don't know about you, but that should raise red flags all over the place when it comes to certain assertions by people that we may know that claim what? Papal primacy from Rome. Doesn't that raise some questions when you've got one see basically giving deference, asking for permission, looking for insight from another see?
Was Celestine particularly theologically known, or had a special characteristic that he would go to him as a person rather than as a bishop?
But you're reacting to the way that this is written. He's actually appealing to the See of Rome.
Oh, okay.
It just happens to be that Celestine was the Pope, so the bishop,
Had
so that
nothing to
he's
do with
naming
him
him.
personally.
No, I don't think there was any. They didn't have any personal connection other than their respective sees. But this raises questions. We flippantly reject the question of Roman supremacy. But we're now in the 5th century, and all of a sudden Rome is starting to crop up and kind of flex her ecclesiastical muscles. Now, I'll try and massage that a little bit by telling you what our church history professor once said, which I thought was kind of funny. He said that it wasn't that Rome had such a lofty theological position, which was which was far superior to any of the other sees. It was that, and this is a quote, they just seemed to come down on the right side all the time. That was his assessment. Now that comes from a Presbyterian, so take that for what it's worth. But it's interesting. It's interesting, if we truly give power to the Holy Spirit in his church, why is it that Rome always came down on the right side of things? At least in the early church. We know that in the Middle Ages they lost their mind and they did all sorts of other weird stuff. But at least in the early church they came down on the right side of the nature of Christ. They came down on the right side, the triunity of the Godhead. They came down on the correct side when it comes to the issue we're dealing with next. They came down on the correct side in the next council. They always seem to come down on the correct side. Pure luck? Not if we believe in God's providence.
Unified leadership would.
A lot of people, I'm not going to get into the weeds on this because there's so much more that we could talk about, but some people will simply say it happens to revolve around Roman conservatism. Rome was always more conservative than other branches, other sees, and therefore they always kind of kept everything close to the vest, and they were very hard pressed to modify their positions on things. So, anyway. So,
The Filioque.
huh?
Until the Filioque.
Well, that's a 20th century position. I'm going to correct you in 3 weeks.
Uh-oh,
Because
you wait.
No, because, and this is, everybody that's why I said, 1800 years later, we have this very definitive, oh, that's what that was, and that is not the case. The Filioque was as complicated as what we're going to deal with today. It wasn't merely cut and dried. And I'll just give you a little taste. Rome could care less one way or the other with the Filioque. They never signed on to it, and they never propagated it in the first 5 centuries. So anyway, we'll get to that. I have a whole list of documentation. So,
That's true.
wow.
I don't dispute that.
Yeah,
I mean,
well, then that's where we're going. Remember, we're dealing with what's occurring in its historical time frame. And that's why understanding these things contextually and historically is important. Because as I've said in other places, it's like firing an artillery round downrange. We have to plot a grid coordinate. And we were taught, well, they don't do it now, they do, everything's laser sighting now, but when we had to do it, we had a map and we had, and we had to plot out an azimuth and a grid coordinate, and the farther out you could extend that grid coordinate, the more accurate your assessment would be. And at least at the time when I was doing this, it was an 8-digit grid coordinate. So if you're here in Kingsport and you're plotting a grid coordinate to fire a round downrange at Bristol, right? What is that? 15 miles from here? Maybe further, a little further? 20 miles? Okay. An 8-digit grid coordinate right on Bristol gets you to your target, but if you're 1 digit off, just 1 digit off, from Kingsport to Colonial Heights, yeah, not going to do that much. You're not going to really cause that much damage. So you're going kind of like that. But now extend that down 20 miles. And you've just blown up a hospital or an orphanage or a school. So here, we have all of these theological battles and all of these men attempting to resolve all of these issues. And they may make one little mistake, and every single century we wind up over here. And that's where we have the debates that we have about the Filioque, about Nestorian. You know, we still have Nestorian churches today? To this day, we still have, and we'll get into what Nestorianism is next week. But that's why I said next week is going to be the real fun stuff. This is all the meat and potatoes type stuff. But anyway, so the Pope is consulted. Cyril is deferring. And how did he do this? Now I'm going to refer to the Acts. Put that in capital letters. Acts, A-C-T-S. It is not the Acts of the Apostles. It is the Acts of the Council of Ephesus. And these are the written documentation of the formal proceedings. So when you hear the word Acts, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the official documentation of the council. In the Acts, the pontiff not only approves the letters and doctrine of Cyril, but disapproves of the perverse dogma of Nestorius. And that distinctly he was unwilling, this is Nestorius, this is Celestine's charge against Nestorius as communicated to him by Cyril. Okay? Celestine points out that Nestorius was unwilling to call the Blessed Virgin, the Mother of God, Theotokos. And we will get to that next week. But what's interesting is that we always talk about Nestorius and the difficulties he had when he was describing the two natures of Christ. But it was the issue of the Theotokos that was the first concern. And you'll see why next week it was the first concern, because it relates back directly to the nature of Christ. Because Nestorius wanted to call Mary the Christotokos, Mother of Christ, not the Mother of God. So we'll get to that. And Celestine says this. He says that Nestorius should be deprived. Now, we're talking about Cyril as the patriarch of the See of Alexandria, one of the five main ones. Here is the Pope in Rome issuing this statement to the bishop of the third see, Constantinople, the Constantinople. Every time I hear that, I think about young Frankenstein
Yeah.
and putting on the Ritz. I'm sorry, it's just because it's Constantinople's in the song. Anyway, sorry, Diane, I know I lost you.
No, actually, I did see that.
You saw, yeah, oh, yeah, the clip, yeah.
Because of the music.
Peter Boyle is awesome. But anyway, so here you've got the Pope issuing this statement about another patriarch. Nestorius should be deprived, stripped, both of his episcopate and his communion. We're taking you out of your job, you're not going to be the head of Constantinople, and we're removing you from your people before you poison them. And you better do it within 10 days. You have 10 days from which the date of this announcement to your sentence. And you must note this, because this stays with the church forever. Nestorius was required to stand up and openly reject everything. In other words, he was required to make a public recantation. And where do we see that popping up in history?
Inquisition.
Inquisition, the Reformation, even today. Talk to any pastor that has to excommunicate somebody in their church, has to deny them communion. The only way that they are allowed back in is public repentance. Right here. And that 10-day thing is kind of interesting because it's alluded to in Nicaea and Constantinople. So I guess 10 days was the maximum amount of time that we're going to give any heretic to change their mind. You got 10 days, otherwise you're done.
Could they even have gotten it to him in 10 days?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. I don't know, maybe carrier pigeons worked faster back then.
Maybe,
I'm sorry?
maybe they knew it wouldn't.
I don't know.
get to
I don't know. That's a really good question. My suspicion is it would have something to do with a scribe annotating a day that the person said they did it. And then it could be communicated, okay, that's within the 10-day period. But you're right. I mean, it isn't like you can, hey, sorry, I'll be there Sunday and I'll do my thing. They didn't have that. And he goes on to say that he has to publicly recant this faithless innovation. You gotta love the way they talked back then. They were not concerned about your feelings. They had no issue. I don't care what your felt needs are. The truth is all that matters. So you have to recant this faithless innovation which endeavors to separate what Scripture, quote, joineth together. I guess they even spoke King James back then. And that is the person of Christ. So now we see the second part of Nestorius' problem. What he did with the two natures of Christ. This is the doctrine of Nestorius that was expressly disapproved and placed most clearly under a pronounced threat of being deposed, of deposition, and excommunication that was issued by sentence of the Roman pontiff on a matter of faith. Note that it was the Roman bishop that made that declaration, adhered to by Cyril, the presiding, who will become the presiding president of the council. And that there would be no confusion, no mistake, no dispute, no leaving anything unaddressed or up for grabs. The Holy Pope commits his authority to Cyril to carry into execution that sentence that the Pope levied. Listen to the words that he uses. Associating, this is Celestine's statement to Cyril, associating the authority of our see and using our person, our place, and our power. Now that doesn't sound to me like an equal talking to another equal. Now, I'm saying this because this lays the groundwork for the problem that we're going to have in about 300 years that will arise with St. Gregory the Great of Rome. But as of right now, we're still on that tipping point. We have the 5 C's. We recognize that they're equal in authority, but maybe Rome's slightly more equal.
First among equals, as the Brits would say.
As some would say. So to Cyril now, to Nestorius himself, to all the clergy of Constantinople, to John the First of Antioch, oh wait, there's the third C, to Bishop Juvenal, Juvenal, weird name, Juvenal, but Juvenal, the Bishop of Jerusalem. So now we've got all 5. All 5 are involved now, with Rome standing above all of them. Juvenal was called by the Council of Nicaea and had been ordered to be especially honored. Cyril writes to the other bishops also. So we're not exclusively talking about all of the patriarchs, we're getting to everybody. We're getting all the bishops. That the sentence given may be duly and in order made known to everybody. Nestorius wasn't going to be hiding under a rock. He was being called out, for lack of a better word, universally. The church was calling him out. But it doesn't end there. Cyril proceeds to execute his office, as conferred on him by the Pope, and performs all that he had been commanded to do by Celestine. He promulgates and executes the decrees of Celestine, declares to Nestorius that after the 10 days prescribed and set forth by the Pope, he has no portion, no intercourse, no place in the priesthood. You got 10 days or you're done. Noting, evidently, that the apostolic authority is being most fully exercised. Cyril is saying, we are dropping the hammer on you. So how do you think Nestorius responds? Of yours.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they tried to disappear him, actually, and yet we still have his churches to this day.
Oh, wait, you.
Wait a minute,
Wait, Nestorius is, you remember Apollinaris? Remember what happened to Apollinaris? What happened to Apollinaris when he was excommunicated?
He
Okay,
went
let's go
somewhere
back,
else.
let's go back half a step.
He went somewhere else and continued.
What was Apollinaris' reputation?
Good man.
Honest,
Yeah.
faithful, devout,
Mhm.
of good repute. Nobody questions his character.
Mhm.
So he gets executed, he gets excommunicated, and where does he go? He goes back home to Antioch and he starts writing, and he just writes for the rest of his life. What's the point of declaring somebody a heretic then? Right? Nestorius, on the other hand, bishop of the royal city, Constantinople, possessed such influence, had deceived this is the historical account, so just note the language, had deceived men's minds with such an appearance of piety, note appearance of piety, had gained so many bishops, and enjoyed such favor with the emperor, younger Theodosius II. And if that's not enough, the great men of Constantinople. So he's got quite the posse. That he could easily throw everything into commotion. In other words, I've got my army, you've got your army, let's throw down. And thus there was need of an ecumenical council. The question being addressed of the highest and most import, and the person of the highest dignity, a bishop, Nestorius, because many bishops, virtually all, almost all of the Eastern bishops, along with the Patriarch of Antioch, John the First, and we're going to talk just a smidge about him. There's a lot we could say about him, but we're just going to talk a smidge about him. Along with John the First. Now note what I said. Many bishops, the great men of Constantinople, John the First, were, as it is so delicately put, ill-disposed towards Cyril and favored Nestorius. There was tremendous division among the feeling of all of the men involved. The whole empire of the East seemed to fluctuate between Cyril and Nestorius. So the necessity of an ecumenical council was indeed mandated. Now, I'm going to spend about 3 minutes talking about John the First of Antioch. John the First was an overt supporter of Nestorius. Antioch. So 2 of the 3 main sees are heretical at this point. When the council was called, John the First arrived late. You could almost say, well, no duh. I mean, he's traveling from Antioch to Ephesus. It's going to take a bit of that's a jaunt. You know, you're moving from here to Turkey. That isn't getting on Amway. I mean, not Amway, Amtrak. Either or. I guess Nestorius was kind of selling Amway. So, I mean, he isn't just hopping on a train and heading out there.
He needed
Right?
a side hustle.
Yeah. So, according to the records, it took John almost 3 weeks to get to the council, and this is according to Cyril's letter to another bishop, Bishop Camarius, who his name is misspelled in a number of different ways, so it's kind of hard to pin him down, but most believe he is, along with Bishop Potaman, a bishop in Egypt, northern Africa. But, so, Cyril then went ahead and initiated the council, further alienating John. You couldn't wait, you couldn't wait, you couldn't wait. And alienating John's followers, gaining Nestorius more support, and putting Cyril on the outs. So what do? You show up late to a council, it's called by your adversary, you're in the minority, what do? Remember what we talked about as we were leading up to Nicaea? What was taking place in all of these regions? Council upon council, upon synod. So John, just looking back at his calendar, oh, look at what we did back then. I'm going to call my own council at the same time. So he convenes an opposing council. And guess who gets condemned? Cyril. So Cyril gets condemned by John. John's buddy Nestorius gets condemned by the Pope through Cyril. And, as I mentioned, Cyril wrote to this bishop. He also said, and this is what he claims, and as I said, it's in this book. The letter that he wrote states, John's emissaries came to Cyril and actually said, the eminent bishop is going to be late. But his honor defers graciously to the council to proceed. So go ahead, and when he shows up, he will step in and participate. This is Cyril writing about the alleged interaction that he had with John the First's emissaries. Eventually, you're excommunicated, you're excommunicated, you're excommunicated. It reminds me of Al Pacino. You're out of order, you're out of order, you're out of... Nobody sees movies anymore. Anyway, so this is what it reminds me of that. And in AD 433, basically 2 years later, Cyril and John, for the most part, reconciled. They reconciled. John still was a Nestorian, but they personally reconciled. And that reconciliation lost John the First virtually all of his followers. So, little tidbit for you. So now we're at the synod. The emperor, moved by these and other reasons, notice the emperor. Now, Theodosius II kind of likes Nestorius. What we don't read in the record is that they were actually now, by this point we were getting to having dual emperors, one in the west, one in the east. And Valentinian II became the emperor in the east. So the emperor Valentinian, now, moved by these and other reasons, wrote to Cyril, it is, note this, our will, note the political influence, that the holy doctrine be discussed and examined in a sacred synod, and that be ratified, which appeareth agreeable to the right faith. How ambiguous can you be? You want to talk about political language. Not orthodoxy, not the Nicene expression, but the right faith. So that whichever side comes out ahead is the right faith.
Yeah, you can determine that.
Whether the wrong party be pardoned by the fathers or no. You gotta love politics. So, in this we see three things. Number one, the judgment of Saint Celestine. Okay, even though there is a judgment of Saint Celestine, another one is required. Oh, well, wait a minute, maybe Rome doesn't have all of that cachet that we seem to be feeling as we're reading all of this. And that other decision is the council. So once again, we fall back on the Nicene pattern, where the council becomes the prominent member, the prominent entity. Secondly, that the judgment of doctrine and individuals, of persons, rests with the church fathers. They are the ones that determine what is right doctrine and what is or who is an acceptable individual. The council puts its, to use a term, imprimatur on it. Not to defer to Rome, but anyway. And then thirdly, that the judgment of the council would be, and this is paramount, would be decisive and final. At least that's what they say. So we can ask those of Nicaea and those of Constantinople whether or not that is the case. And Cyril, and the emperor adds, those who everywhere preside over the priesthood, and through whom we ourselves are and shall be professing the truth, must be judges of this matter. So in other words, what I just gave, I'm kind of taking back a little bit. I gotta have some say in this. So basically, it's we see on whose faith we rest. That's the question. And we see in whose judgment is the final and irreversible authority. So these are the three elements that come out of that statement by the emperor. Now, both the emperor affirmed and the bishops confessed that this was done. Now, they're saying, yes, all of this is in harmony and in good effect according to the ecclesiastical canons of the time. And so, everyone, including Celestine himself, prepared themselves for the council. So, whereas we saw the Pope kind of exercising and flexing his arms and swinging his weight around, now all of a sudden he's made to be a spectator along with everyone else. Now, what does that tell you about the council? What does that tell you about council? What's the first thing that you think of when you hear that, oh, okay, now he's taking half a step back? What's the position of the council then in your eyes? Remember, we're talking about authority, so think in terms of authority.
The council has hired.
Yeah, the council throws its weight around,
So the council demotes the Pope?
not demotes. Supersedes maybe,
But it takes precedence.
maybe
Okay.
Is
supersedes,
the
takes
Pope smart
precedence.
enough to allow the council to be a fall guy?
I'm sorry?
Does the Pope allow the council to be a
No,
fall guy?
no, that's attributing that's attributing a motive that's nowhere
Okay.
indicated. The harsh reality of the politics in the church does not truly manifest itself until the Middle Ages. That's where it gets really ugly, because once we hit the 700s, the 8th century, that's when the Holy Roman Empire starts to come into play. And now Pope and Emperor are, for all intents and purposes, almost the same person. And that's when politics becomes the problem. But at this point, these men were functioning in good faith. And even Celestine was functioning in good So, Cyril then, as a representative of the authority of Rome, doesn't do anything else. He's done. If the Pope is willing to step back and allow the council to have precedence, then what's Cyril? What does he have to say, right? He was charged by the Pope to do this. So now he's fulfilled his episcopal instructions. The Pope said, do it. He did it. That's that. And though he was named by Celestine to execute the pontifical decree, Nestorius, note this, remained in his original rank. The sentence of the Universal Council is now waited upon, and the emperor had expressly decreed that before the assembling and the common sentence of the Most Holy Council, no change should be made in any manner at all on any private authority. So in other words, sit on your hands, shut your mouth. Now this came from the emperor. Nobody has the right to cast aspersions until the council resolves the issue. So, rightly and in order, according to the emperor, for this was demanded by the majesty of the Universal Council. In other words, they thought that this council was so elevated, it was so majestic, that it had to make the final decree. And all of you little peons within this battle need to zip it. So we see then both Cyril obeyed and the bishops sat on their hands. They rested. And it was established that although the sentence of the Roman pontiff on matters of faith and on persons, as we said, judged for violation of the faith, had been passed and promulgated, made an official decree. All of that was suspended while the authority of the Universal Council and its decision was waited. Okay? Note the tension between the two. That's what you have to see. I've got authority, I've got authority, I've got authority, we've called the council. Oh, okay, well now I have to be quiet. Okay? And all of this was going on before we ever got to Ephesus. And the council hasn't even been called yet. Well, it's been called, but it hasn't even been set. The bishops and Nestorius himself were to come to Ephesus. The Universal Council was to begin, Cyril being president and representing the Pope, because the Pope was unable to make it. His flight got caught up in Rome and he couldn't get out. And as being appointed by the pontiff himself to execute the pontiff's sentence, Cyril was the mouthpiece for Celestine. Now, in the first course of the proceedings, the following was done. The above mentioned letter of the emperor was read. So they read the letter. And there was the notation that an ecumenical council should be held. All proceedings in the meantime be suspended, deferring to the council. The letter was then read and placed into the official record, in the Acts of the Council of Ephesus. It was approved by the fathers that all the decrees of Celestine in the matter of Nestorius had been suspended until the Holy Council should give its sentence. So this is now a matter of public record. You can read it right here. The question then might be asked, and you may be wondering, if it was the will of the council that was merely that the emperor should be allowed to prohibit in the interim, with the effect being given to the sentence of the Apostolic See. In other words, you might ask, well, does that mean that the emperor and his power actually called into being the effect because he suspended everything? No. So according to the Acts, rather, by the intervention of the General Council's authority, or the convocation of which, according to the discipline of those times, was left to the emperor. The convocation was left to the emperor. The legacy of Constantine. Remember, he was the one that called the first council and then said, okay, you guys run with it, I'm going to sit over here, I'll kibitz maybe, but I'm not going to get involved. And then Theodosius I said, oh no, wait a minute, I like this, I think I'm going to take a more prominent note. And now we get to Theodosius II and Valentinian II, and it's just like, oh no, we're taking over, guys. This is our ball of wax. So, wherefore, the decree of the pontiff had been promulgated and notified, and the 10 days had been long past. Missed that train. Nestorius was held by the council itself. Note this. By the council, Nestorius was viewed to be a bishop. He was called by the name of the most religious bishop, Bishop of Constantinople. He was referred to as his patriarch. And by that name, too, will the patriarch of Constantinople, Nestorius, 3 times cited and summoned to take his seat with the other bishops in the Holy Council. Now I'm going to pause. Why do you think that is so important?
Well, he'd been stripped of his job. Removed
No,
from his
that was the threat.
Oh, it was only a threat. They didn't do it.
Well, that was, remember what Celestine said. This is what's going to happen if you don't do this. That's what this whole thing is about. But here he is. He's identified as the Patriarch of Constantinople, the most holy see, Nestorius. Take your seat.
It prevents a single bishop from kicking out another bishop. It has to be by council, they have to meet.
Okay, that's one element. There's another element.
Makes it ecumenical.
What makes what ecumenical?
You have all 5 of the pentarchy represented at the council.
And why is that prominent in this situation right now?
Because East and West are splitting in the politically.
You're encasing it properly, you're just not getting right to the nub. Because the Patriarch of Constantinople has to sit with the Patriarch of Alexandria, Rome, Antioch, and Jerusalem and announce heresy amongst all of the other patriarchs. He has to publicly declare his position amongst all of the other bishops, calling into question his faithfulness and orthodoxy. So, this expression, to take his seat, is distinctly written, and it is added in order to answer what was charged against him. So you're sitting amongst all of your peers, and now you got to put up or shut up. For it was their full purpose that he should recognize in whatever way the Ecumenical Council, as he would then be afterward beyond doubt answerable to it. What do you think his response was? You're gonna love this.
Declined.
That's a polite way of putting it. Nestorius refused to appear in Ephesus. He chose to have the doors of his cathedral barred and protected with an armed militia so that no one could approach him. That was his response. The council opened with what document being read to everyone?
The letter that he sent to them telling him he wasn't coming?
No, remember what we did in Nicaea. How did it end? What was read at the Council of Nicaea?
The creed.
The creed.
Yeah.
And what was the pronouncement at Nicaea concerning the creed? It was to be read to the church. Council of Ephesus opened with the reading of the Nicene Creed. Now, these are some of the things that I hope you were wrestling with as we went along, because these all play an important role as we move forward. The political presence. I briefly went through and highlighted the difference between Constantine Theodosius I and then the two-headed emperor Theodosius II and Valentinian II, and how on the one hand we had almost a hands-off, on the other hand we had, no, I want to be involved, and now we've got, oh, no, I'm the one that's taking charge here. And then we have the influence of the Roman bishop, and we saw very clearly Rome taking a step and saying, no. What he said was wrong. That is not orthodoxy. And the other bishops agreeing, conceding, deferring, till the council was called. And then we have the interaction between all three. The emperor making the assessment, the pope identifying the problem with the theology in the individual, and then the council making the final decision. See, none of this is as simple as we like to think when we look back and we say, oh yeah, Council of Ephesus, they made this decision. Yeah, they did. But boy, oh boy, did it create some strain. Next week, we're going to deal with these two issues. And what most people don't remember about the Council of Ephesus, most people, is that even though Nestorius rises to the top, Pelagianism was also condemned. Now, the challenge with Pelagianism is because Pelagius was a British bishop. See, we don't get off scot-free. Even Anglicans have their nut jobs. And Pelagius was brought up on charges. And when we read who was called, there's one name that shines above all. St. Augustine. And these are the issues that sprang from Nestorius. We will get to these. I'm not going to say any more than what you have on the board. We'll talk about these at length next week. But the first issue they had with him was the Theotokos versus the Christotokos. We always think it's, oh, well, it was the two natures of Christ. No, the two natures of Christ and the problem that he had there derives from that, and you will see that next week. And then out of that rose this. Was there one soul or were there two souls? Okay? And then we get to this. Everybody's favorite bugaboo.